Our next and final speaker for today's symposium is Robin Kimmerer. Dr. Kimmerer is an enrolled member of the Citizen Band Potawatomi. Is a scientist, award-winning writer, and distinguished teaching professor of environmental biology at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, New York. Robin is the founding director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, whose mission is to create programs that draw upon the knowledge of both indigenous and scientific communities toward the mutual goal of achieving sustainable environmental practices. Her research interests include ecological restoration and building resilience to climate change impacts. In collaboration with tribal partners, she and her students have an active research program in the ecology and restoration of plants of cultural significance to Native peoples. Let's all give a warm welcome to Robin Kimmerer.
Does anybody need a stretch? Yes? Okay, let's take a quick 30-second stretch. Ooh. Wonderful, human beings moving. Bojo. Shabadas gegish kokwena deshnukas. Bodwe wadmi kwenda. Megaze do dem. Nin mami kwenda mampi yayan. I don't speak very much of our Potawatomi language, but as you know, it's an endangered species, and so we're told to speak it and breathe life into it any chance that we get. So I introduced myself in the language. I am a member of the Potawatomi Nation and a member of the Bear Clan and the Eagles as well. And miigwech to the museum for putting together this wonderful symposium and festival. I'm really eager to be part of this. And I also want to say at the outset that the knowledge that I will be sharing today is, of course, which way is up? That's always the question, which end is up? The knowledge that I'll be sharing today is, of course, not my knowledge alone, but the collective knowledge of our peoples and indeed the knowledge of the land herself. And food, of course, which brings us together, is the connecting place, isn't it? It's the center of this web of relationships between language and land and history and culture. And indeed, I like to think about food as the central place, the nexus, where all these relationships come together in our relationships with Shakmikwe, with our mother, the earth, who, like all good mothers, provides us with nourishment and with good food. And I am a scientist, and sometimes we speak different languages there too. These gifts of Mother Earth are often called commodities or natural resources, but in our Anishinaabe way, we think of them as gifts from Mother Earth. And let's follow just one strand of that web of relationships, the food, since we are right down the street from the USDA. Well, let's look for a minute at this one way of thinking about food as that which we take into our bodies to nourish ourselves. But oftentimes in the non-native traditions, we come to think about food as stuff. It's stuff that we consume. It's stuff that we get from the store, and we have the questions of what shall we eat and how shall we prepare it, and all of those things. But representations of food solely as that which nourishes our body misses many important dimensions. Because when we think about what is really on our plate, my plate, look at all of the things that go into that plate. Our food isn't just stuff that we take in to be healthy, remembering it is the gifts of Mother Earth, the gifts of pollinators, the gifts of healthy soil, the microbes that are present in that soil, the birds, the seeds, the farmers, and generations of knowledge that go into creating what it is that goes onto our plate. And we forget that this is really what our plate looks like. Every time that we fill our plates, we are the beneficiaries of the gifts of the earth. And the choices that we have in what we eat and how we raise what we eat, of course, has consequences for that web of relationships. Every single thread is impacted by how we behave. And so at the outset, I think it's of utmost importance when we think about that full plate before us, that we recognize the gifts of the earth and engage in the first step, which is gratitude. Gratitude for all of those lives which end up on our plate. And then the question that we have to ask ourselves when we start to think about the world and about food as gifts from other living beings is, what is our response to gifts? Because as human people, we know what our natural response is. When someone gives us a gift, the first response is gratitude, no? And the second gift is trying to think about reciprocity, of what it is that we can give in return. And even though we live in this beautiful world made out of gifts, each one of our lives is somehow harnessed to food-producing institutions and certainly to an economy which constantly asks, what more can we take from the earth? When in fact the question that we should be asking in reciprocity is, what does the earth ask of us? And native cultures all over the world are cultures of gratitude. We heard that beautifully in some of the stories and examples that our distinguished panelists have shared already. And cultures of gratitude then become cultures of reciprocity that call us as human people to participate in the well-being of the world, to recognize ourselves not just as consumers, but as bearers of our own gifts that we then give back to the earth in response. And you know, given the crises that we face of climate change, of massive droughts, of living in the age of extinction, gratitude might seem like kind of weak tea in response to those challenges. But I would submit to you that it is really powerful medicine, because gratitude forces us to come into relationship with all that is. It forces us to acknowledge those beings who've given their lives to be on our plate. Gratitude is humbling. I think it's a good antidote to the arrogance of our time. It reminds us that we as human people are just one member of this whole beautiful democracy of species, and it reminds us that the earth does not belong to us. Gratitude draws us into this covenant of reciprocity, of again remembering that we have something to give. And this question of what is it that we as humans have to give back in response for all of these gifts is central to Indigenous environmental philosophy and indeed to practice. How do we take from the earth and how do we give back? And among traditional peoples all over the world, this question of how do we give back is central. And I want to share with you some teachings of what has come to be called the honorable harvest. You heard some of these very same ideas from the previous speakers. But since we human people, unlike our elder brothers, the plants, who we can't photosynthesize, too bad. So we have to take other lives in order to live. These are the lives of our relatives, of non-human persons with whom we share the earth. And so it matters a great deal how we take those lives. This is our food systems. How do we take the lives that we need in order to survive? And these guidelines for the honorable harvest, I'll spend a fair bit of time here, have been shared with me over my life by wise and generous teachers, whether we're picking berries or digging roots or picking medicines. And I'm very grateful to those teachers who have shared it with me. And one of the things that we're always taught is that when we get to a meadow or we get to the woods where the plants live that we want to collect, we simply don't run around grabbing everything in sight. In fact, we don't take the first plant, ever. We're told never to take the first plant, and if you never take the first, you're never going to take the last. This is a practice which has both material and spiritual dimensions, doesn't it? It's an implicit conservation ethic. And if we do encounter, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. If we do encounter a second plant or a third or a fourth, I've been taught that we ask permission from that plant, that we introduce ourselves to that plant and explain what it is that we have come for, what is our need. And I know in much of mainstream society, if you were out in the meadow addressing a strawberry plant, people might think you were crazy. But in a worldview that understands those plants as our relatives, it's just good manners. And if you're going to ask permission, you have to listen for the answer, right? And there are lots of ways to listen for that answer. You can look and see, is the population healthy enough to support your taking it? There are lots of ways, both empirical and cultural, intuitive, to understand whether the plant and that community have given you permission or not. But if the answer is no, you go home. You go home with an empty basket, because taking that which you don't have permission for, we also know as stealing. And if you are granted permission, then you only take what you need. That's one reason it's so important at the outset to say to that plant, what brings you here? What do you need? And that's all you take. And separating, of course, our needs and our wants is really difficult in our affluence-plagued society, isn't it? Knowing the difference between our needs and our wants. But this protocol causes you to reflect on that very question. The honorable harvest also counsels that when it comes time to take that plant, that root, the leaves, the berries, the fruits which have dropped on the ground, we do so in such a way that our techniques minimize harm to the plant and to the place that it lives. Don't use a shovel if a digging stick will do. The honorable harvest also counsels that we must use everything that we take. Because if you're going to take another life, it's really important, of course, that you don't waste it. It's disrespectful of life to waste what you have taken. And we have forgotten in our affluent society, that the easiest way to have everything that you need is not to waste what you already have. And that's built into the teachings of the honorable harvest. We're taught also that in harvesting, again, gratitude, cultures of gratitude, is our first responsibility, to say thank you to that plant for that which you have just filled your basket with. And that thankfulness is manifest in then sharing it. Just as that plant has shared its life with you, we're taught that we have to share it with others. Leave enough there for the other beings who need it, and whatever you have harvested, be certain to share. And as we know, in times when there's fluctuating availability of resources, lean times and abundant times, sharing is the way that everybody survives. Sharing is a tool, a social tool for resilience, and I think we have forgotten some of that. And then reciprocate the gift. Before you leave with your basket full of food, reciprocate the gift that you have taken. That could manifest itself in many ways. Oftentimes we leave a gift for that plant. Oftentimes you then will tend the plant. You'll weed it around it. Maybe you'll break up the seed heads and go plant them somewhere else. You give a gift back to those plants which have taken care of you. All of these are part of the unwritten code or the protocol of the honorable harvest. There are so many ways that we reciprocate, and it's important that we think about how our own gifts become reciprocation of the gifts of the earth. And one of the also most important teachings that we have also heard a bit about is to take only that which is given to us. I don't know about you, but it's pretty clear to me that fruits and berries and seeds are given to us in limited amounts. But this teaching of the honorable harvest isn't just a quaint old teaching for how we pick berries. Take only that which was given to us, I think could be the basis of an agricultural policy. It could be the basis of an energy policy, because it doesn't seem to me that coal from mountaintop removal is in any way given to us. But I digress. And so this, then, is the question of our time, isn't it? How do we enter into reciprocity with the living world, particularly when more and more of us live in urban settings? How do we reciprocate the gifts of the plant world? And it really matters. It is good manners, it is good cultural practice, traditional protocols, but it is also the way, ecologically, the world works, biophysically. I'm an ecologist, and so one of the things that we study and we understand is that equilibrium in nature is produced by reciprocity. Scientists call it negative feedback loops. It's reciprocity, the giving and taking, production and decomposition, biogeochemical cycles. The way the world works is in reciprocity. When we engage in positive feedback loops, then we put ourselves into these rapid, accelerating changes from which oftentimes there is no return. So negative feedback or reciprocity is how the ecological world works. And believe me, the laws of thermodynamics have not been repealed just on behalf of our species. Unlimited growth is simply not possible. We can't keep taking without replenishment. And the Honorable Harvest and other Indigenous guidelines like it offer us a way to think about reciprocity, that how can we sustain the ones who sustain us, particularly in our food systems. And again, I want to emphasize that these are ancient teachings which have kept people and civilizations flourishing in their home places for millennia. And while they're ancient solutions, they're also solutions of tremendous urgency as we try to reform our food and production systems for a sustainable future. And one of the most important elements of that I want to talk about today is this notion of food security. Food security, i.e. having enough food on your plate for yourself, for your family, for your village, your community, indeed for your nation. That was, of course, a major concern for traditional peoples, as it is for contemporary peoples today. And much of native science, of traditional ecological knowledge, is related to this question of how does one achieve food security, sometimes in agricultural settings that we've been hearing a fair bit about, but also in how we live in a non-agricultural setting. Our people knew and continue to practice knowing the dramatic fluctuations in resource abundance and how to respond to them. They had to be excellent scientists, excellent land managers, conservation biologists, soil scientists, nutritionists. All of this traditional knowledge is manifest in our traditional foodways. And one of the most important elements that comes from this traditional ecological knowledge is that in order to manage for food security, you must manage for biodiversity. And our ancestors and the practices that they used, the philosophy as well as the on-the-land practices, created biodiversity at multiple scales. And these are forms of reciprocity, either in an agricultural landscape or in what we call a tended landscape, which I'll have more to say about. But many of the practices and the scales that led to this generation and maintenance of biodiversity certainly happened at the landscape level, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second. Certainly in the diversity of crops and plant foods and animal foods that our people use. It's estimated that today, anybody know the number where 80% of your calories come from how many plant species? Anybody know? Sorry? It's about 10. It's about 10 of the 250,000 flowering plant species that are out there to choose from. We have very limited species diversity that we utilize to the detriment of our land and to our health as well. And then, of course, genetic diversity is a component of biodiversity as well. And by maintaining and generating diversity at all of these levels, from the landscape to the genome, our people really demonstrated that what's good for the land is also good for people. We also know that today industrial agriculture operates on the complete opposite of this principle, doesn't it? Industrial agriculture really optimizes uniformity and homogeneity because, of course, this maximizes the capacity for profit. It maximizes the potential for mechanization, for short-term return rather than long-term sustainability. But it has, as we understand, grave consequences for health of the land as well as for health of the people. And what we are finding is that in the ecological science community, where they're seeing all kinds of scholarship over the last several decades, which reinforce this understanding that biodiversity leads to stability and resilience, resilience to coming changes like climate change and species extinctions. Agricultural science is catching up to traditional ecological knowledge and also understanding that biodiversity is essential in food production systems. But unfortunately, for the most part, agricultural practice is not following the model that we've seen spoken of by my colleagues. And this is a really important opportunity where we can think about the ways that traditional understanding of manipulating and creating biodiversity for food security can influence contemporary agriculture. The last thing that I really want to mention about this refers back to a non-agricultural setting, and this is the setting of food gathering and food production systems in a non-agricultural landscape. Now, you might be scratching your head about this, and if so, you're just in the same boat as when the first settlers came to my part of the world, up in the Northeast, in Maple Nation. When they first came here, in their journals, they wrote that the native people here have no food production system. Interesting perspective. They thought that these beautiful, well-nourished people were simply living off, as the journalist said, the fat of the land. They were living off nature's bounty. Why? Because they didn't see uniform crops. They didn't see rows. They didn't see fences. They didn't see barns, and they therefore concluded that people did not have a food production system. By this, they then justified, in a sense to themselves, dispossession, thinking that, well, these people aren't using the land, we will. They were engaged and embedded in the myth of the pristine, that this landscape was unmanaged. And of course, nothing could be farther from the truth. It didn't look like European agriculture, but it was a highly productive food production system, where people moved between resource patches. As you see here, just a small example of the seasonal rounds with which people moved within their territories to places where the berries were, to where the fish were, to where the waterfowl were gathering. So they moved among different habitat patches in the territories to collect food. Therefore, the landscape had to be complex. It had to be biodiverse to produce all of these different materials of so-called wild resources, which were in fact tended resources. And it created a system of tremendous abundance in food production. And again, to reinforce this point of why was the land so productive? What was the source of this abundance? Certainly the land, fertile soils, lots of rainfall evenly distributed throughout the year, seasonality, glaciers. There were lots of things that combined to make this incredibly productive landscape. But what is often missed is that it's not just the gifts of the land, but the gifts of the people as well. People living in reciprocity with their landscape to create biodiversity. So these sources of abundance were not just nature, but sophisticated land management based on traditional ecological knowledge. Oops, sorry, I've gotten way out of sequence here. There we go, sorry. So traditional ecological knowledge has to then really be based on a very solid and sophisticated understanding of ecological succession, the way that landscapes change after some kind of disturbance to those landscape, a disturbance to the dominant vegetation. You know this, after a field, for example, is abandoned or a forest is cut, first there are the annual plants, then the biennials, then the perennials, then the shrubs, then the early successional trees, right? You with me? There's this whole long successional sequence. And by manipulating that successional sequence, one could increase biodiversity and food security. And one of the most powerful, potent tools that people use was, of course, fire. I'm a Potawatomi. Bodwe Wadme means the people of the fire. And it was understood that fire was given to people to bring good things to the earth. And we also know that uncontrolled fire, wildfire, does not have that effect. And we know that Western policies of fire suppression have in fact reduced biodiversity and increased the likelihood of wildfire. So again, here is another food system in the forested landscape that needs adjustment based on traditional principles. Controlled fire differs dramatically from wildfire. Fire was applied in a very sophisticated way. If you wanted to have annual grass seeds being produced, you had to burn every year. But if you want good berry grounds, you burn every 3 to 5 years. If you want to encourage the beaver to stay at that pond and therefore have lots of aspen after they've eaten a lot of the aspen, every 10 years or so, that land is burned. Again, to maintain this mosaic using disturbances. And even really low, annual burning in forests can actually create a wholly different kind of forest, replacing fire-sensitive species with fire-tolerant species. And many of the fire-tolerant species are nut producers, butternuts, hickory nuts, oaks, etc., for acorns. The forests were changed. The settlers came and looked and said, well, they just look like forests to us. But in fact, it was agroforestry. These forests had been changed in order to provide these huge crops of fat and protein-rich nuts. Tremendous abundance of fruits in all of these ecotones or marginal areas between habitats, all kinds of wild greens in season, and of course also manipulation of the landscape for animal protein. Again, you read in those early settler journals and they say they have no barns, they have no fences. Well, why in the world would you need to build a barn or fences if in fact you could create in the middle of a forest matrix landscape lush green meadows? Where are the deer going to be? Manipulation of wetland ecosystems for the rich sources of root foods, carbohydrates that are there. And of course, from my own people, the staple food of the wetlands, monomen or wild rice, was managed according to traditional ecological knowledge as well. So bottom line, the genius of indigenous land management for food security was by generating biodiversity. And in both ecological practice and today in conservation practice, we've forgotten that human beings can be a potent source of intervention in creating biodiversity through human use. We have this mindset of humans and nature as a bad mix, when in fact it can be a very productive mix when done according to the principles of the honorable harvest, in accordance with the laws of the land. I'll just touch briefly on the fact that that biodiversity is also created in pools of genetic diversity, and Clayton touched on that point in thinking about the sophisticated plant breeding that people engage in to maintain genetic diversity and all kinds of different genotypes of plants. One of the last points I think that I would like to make has to do with creating diversity, biodiversity, in agronomic systems themselves. In every one of the gardens that the previous speakers have spoken of, it's a polyculture, isn't it? Many, many species growing together with all the ecological, cultural, and nutritional benefits that accrue from having all of those plants together. And probably one of the most well-known examples of this is Three Sisters agriculture, right? The Three Sisters polyculture of growing corn, beans, and squash together, where the yields of those three species when grown in combination can match and in many cases exceed that of those plants grown in monoculture. It's complementarity between the species where the whole is much greater than the sum of its parts. You know that the elder plant, corn, is really the scaffolding of a Three Sisters garden. Right? It produces a tremendous amount of food through C4 photosynthesis, maximizes light use efficiency. It's a brilliant plant. But we also know that the beans climb that plant, right? They climbed the corn, and therefore they increased their light use efficiency by climbing up and getting higher light. But it's not a free ride for them, is it? Because the beans are fertilizing the corn. And then we have the cucurbits, the squashes, the pumpkins, the melons growing at the feet of the beans and the corn. And they, of course, have this really important role in shading the soil with those big prickly leaves that they have. They keep the soil moist and cool. They suppress weeds. Each one of these plants has its own way of being, contributing to the whole. It's a biodiverse and highly productive garden. What I'd like to ask you to think about, based on the talks that you have heard today, which incorporate the great ingenuity of traditional knowledge and native science in food systems production, if we could extend the wisdom of a Three Sisters garden to thinking about knowledge systems. Land we think of as the source of knowledge. So it's appropriate to think about a garden as a place where a symbiosis of knowledge might occur. Traditional ecological knowledge I represent through the metaphor of the corn. It is the elder plant. It is the keystone for so many of our communities and peoples. It was here first. It's the scaffold. Traditional ecological knowledge contains not only this empirical information of what works, what doesn't work, but it also contains values. It is simultaneously material and spiritual. And today, when we look at some of the issues that face us, we are trying to use one kind of knowledge which is value-free to solve cultural problems which include values. So traditional ecological knowledge, by having both of those present, is key. What kind of knowledge is it that purports to be value-free, purely material, purely reductionist? Western science, right? It's a powerful way of knowing, a very powerful way of knowing, but I would submit it's not the only way of knowing that we need to solve our sustainability problems. I think about scientific ecological knowledge as the bean, powerful, fertile, always wandering. But you know what happens? Has anybody ever had this problem where you plant pole beans in the garden without corn for them to crawl on? They overtake everything, and you don't get much yield of anything. But if you have beans guided by corn, then you've got productivity. What if we had scientific tools guided by the values of traditional knowledge for maximum productivity? In order to do that, we need a microclimate that favors that kind of symbiosis of knowledge, like the squash. And can we create a climate in which these kinds of knowledges can work together, not become one another? The corn does not become the beans does not become the corn, but they work together in order to feed people. And so what I am imagining, again, taught to us by our elders, the plants, is might we have a knowledge symbiosis for future food systems, which is based on traditional philosophy, guiding the tools of Western science so that all might be fed. Thank you.